Good evening, everybody. It's time to get going. My name is Chris Lubkeman, and I have the great pleasure and privilege of leading the Strategic Foresight Hub in the Office of the President here at the ETH in Zurich. Tonight, you have joined us for our global lecture, which is super exciting. I don't have to tell you who's speaking, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't know who is speaking, both of our speakers. The ETH Global Lecture Series is a platform where we like to bring remarkable people together to share their personal insights, their interests, experiences, and expertise on contemporary topics. In addition to simply satisfying our curiosity to learn, we also hope that these dialogues will expand all of our perspectives to broaden thinking, challenge our opinions, your opinions, my opinions, and through this, make an even more meaningful contribution to our society. The title of tonight's dialogue, From Farm to Fork, a Sustainable Approach to Eating. And I'm really excited about this, because I love food, so this is kind of close to my heart, Regenerative food systems. So most of you already know our first guest. He is the CEO of Nestle, has a passion for healthy, delicious, and nutritious products. He's been leading Nestle's efforts to halve its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and is fully committed to the firm's net zero 2050 ambition. In this context, he's driving the company's support for a just transition to regenerative food system. So let us welcome to the ETH podium, not the stage, Mark Schneider.
Chris, thank you for the introduction. Also, my thanks to ETH for this invitation today. It's part of a super interesting visit I spent today here with a number of researchers and some of the people we cooperate with. And I can tell you, when you look at my diary, my calendar, those are the days. That was a day when I truly had fun and got inspired, and that's fantastic. I also want to thank all of you for the turnout here on a Friday afternoon. I'm impressed. I have to tell you that my attitude was a bit different when I was a student, so I'm deeply appreciative. I didn't bring any slides. When I give presentations at the company, I give people a very simple deal in the beginning, and that is, if you listen carefully, I will not PowerPoint you. Okay, so I offer you the same deal today. And in terms of why we're here and why we're talking about the subject, let me speak about two very important convictions. The first one is our personal health, and across all of us, the public health, is very much determined, very much driven by what we eat. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail. And then second, environmental outcomes, at a time when we're seeing so much environmental stress around us, is also very much driven by how that food and beverage is made. And when we think about environmental burdens, we think about heavy industry, we think about energy generation, we think about air travel, we think about cars. But the fact that agriculture stands, depending on what study you look at, for about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, or according to some, even 30% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, that is not so generally well known. But it is a fact. And obviously, as we are facing a planet here with 9 billion people, eventually 10 billion people, how we produce our food and how we ensure that those food and beverage products are healthy is a key challenge. We're summarizing that in a slogan that you've seen in similar terms elsewhere. We call it good for you, that's the health part, and good for the planet when it comes to the environment. We didn't invent that slogan. We stole it with pride, but I think it's the best way to summarize what a food company should be about. And before I go into more on the depth, let me also tell you a little bit about my personal journey on both of these dimensions. So thinking about the students here in the audience, when I was a student, I certainly can't claim to have been a very picky eater. In fact, I would have told you, as a lifelong physical exercise and sports fan, that as long as you work out regularly, that's probably your best determinant of future health. And then it doesn't really matter so much what you eat. Well, 15 to 20 years in healthcare in between as part of my professional experience, and I would tell you exactly the opposite. And these days, I am a very picky eater. I spend a lot of time selecting what I think is right for me. and what's right for my family. And I would even say that if you have to skip a day in terms of working out, or if there's a period where you have to take it a little easier, that's okay. But what you shouldn't compromise on is trying to find the nutrition that's right for you and really being disciplined about that. So that's where really, as I went through life and as I saw healthcare, in some sense trying to patch up health problems, but unable to prevent health problems, I really came to the conclusion that nutrition has so much more power to do that over time. And as we think about public health, it is a key issue. Now, second, on the environment, again, thinking back to my student days, 1980s, and focusing on what I believe is the most important environmental problem of our time, and that is the greenhouse gas burden and the climate getting out of control. That was not a mainstream general public concern. Some people, including probably at ETH, were working on this at the time, so it was not completely unknown. And it started to kind of infiltrate public opinion, become wider and more mainstream, late 80s, early 90s. Among politicians, ironically, when you look at the European political landscape, the first real senior political person to talk about it in Europe was Maggie Thatcher. Few people remember that, but she was a committed environmentalist and certainly quite committed about the reduction of greenhouse gases. I never flat out denied climate change. That's important to me. But if you had asked me in the 1990s about climate change, I would have told you, look, rebuilding our modern economy and rebuilding industry and everything in climate neutral ways is so incredibly expensive that I would want to see a few more years of data rolling in to be sure that the problem is really what we think it is. And I would also want to see a better proof of that causal relationship before we embark on such an expensive and an arduous project. Lo and behold, 30 years later, you have 30 years of almost eerie correlation between parts per million in the atmosphere, especially of CO2, but other gases as well, and then the rising temperatures. And for those of you who learned the first semester that correlation is not causation, yes, that's true, but the science about that causal relationship has also improved so much that it's something that, frankly, no one should deny any longer. And in management, one of the things I insist on very often with my colleagues is don't wait till all the facts are finally on the table. You have to work by the 80-20 principle, otherwise you're always going to be too late. And hence, the time for action is probably a little bit overdue already, but it's certainly now. It's not something where anyone should tell you, let's wait another decade so that we're really certain the planet is warming up. It is warming up, and we need to do something about that. Now, as I look at both of these dimensions again, what is our vision? What are we trying to do about it? First, on nutrition, clearly, over the years, as part of very patient work, and this is a 20, 25-year effort, we have been reducing the contents of salt, sugar, saturated fat in our products. We made a deliberate decision not to retreat from enjoyable products, so we're committed to also offering sweets and ice creams and the like, but we worked very patiently to make the nutritional footprint of those products better. We believe that that better reflects how everyone day-to-day is consuming. When you think back about what you consumed the last day, it is not only about keeping yourself alive and healthy, there is an element of enjoyment as well. So catering to that, but catering to it in a responsible manner, in our point of view, is the right way to go. In terms of a personal vision, and talking to a room full of scientists here, if I could sort of lay out my I have a dream vision on nutrition, it is this. At some point, when there's a non-invasive way of checking the essential biological values in your blood in real time, and that point is not that far away, at that point, it will be possible to provide the nutrition that is exactly right for you for that moment. Because when we talk about healthy foods, healthy diets, what constitutes a healthy diet, we all know is very different by person, but it's also different over time. So whether you've worked out on that day or not, whether you're just fighting an infection, yes or no, whether you're cold, whether you're hot, what constitutes perfect food and beverage for you actually varies over time. And the only way to know that is to know what exactly is in your blood at that moment. The science behind what is good and bad is pretty well established now. The science that's missing is exactly knowing that at fingertips notice and essentially without hurting the person, which of course when you access the bloodstream now you're doing. When that's there, we will have the tools to really provide what is perfect for that machine, which the human is, that biological machine. And that is something over time that we very much aspire to. Now, some people will be incredibly focused on that and will love it, and some people won't. And for those people, I mean, this is essentially your choice. I think some other parts of a healthy nutritional strategy will kick in, and that is what I call aiding responsible consumption. And responsible consumption, to have that aided, you want, for example, perfect transparency about what's in the product, right on the pack or back of the pack. You would want some helpful portion guidance so that you don't inadvertently consume too much or too little. And you also want, for example, a very stringent marketing and nutrition policy so that minors who can't make educated decisions on their own yet can actually get protected. And all of those we're committed as well. So on the one hand, we're trying to push the state of the art when it comes to the science, but on the other hand, we're also trying to support that notion of responsible consumption. On the environment, Chris mentioned it as part of the intro, I think the most ambitious and by far, I'm really saying by far, the most expensive undertaking is decarbonization. And here we have a commitment that goes back to the year 2019. We signed up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. We looked at the various standards around, but this one, which is supported by the United Nations, in our view, was the most credible, most widespread standard to do it by. Under those rules, we had 2 years to issue a plan on how we accomplish carbon neutrality by the year 2050. We didn't even use the 2 years. About a year later, we came out with a net zero roadmap that lays out intermediate goals like the minus 20% by 2025, minus 50% by 2030. And we also laid out in detail what exactly we're doing to accomplish those targets. We focused very much on CO2, but I can tell you the plan and the commitment stands on the totality of greenhouse gas emissions. And that also means, just to preempt a very frequent criticism, we do have laid in that a methane reduction plan, because without getting methane under control, you simply don't get to net zero approach on greenhouse gas emissions, at least not when you're in food and beverage products. So all of that we laid out in the year 2020. It was seen, in all modesty, as one of the gold standards in food and beverage production when it comes to the level of detail. And yes, since then, we've been tracking on this plan. So we are on track for that first leg, the minus 20% reduction by 2025. In fact, we're publishing these numbers once a year. We just published the 2022 emissions with our sustainability report in March. And lo and behold, when you look at it from a 2018 baseline, we're now already below the 2018 emissions, even though the company since then has grown very strongly. So even by now, what we've been able to do is decouple the growth of the business from the level of greenhouse gas emissions. Now we're going for that real reduction over time, the absolute reduction, which is independent of our growth, and that is the minus 20% by 2025 and minus 50 by 2030. So it's frightfully expensive. It's really something that takes a lot of effort. Most of the internal things we have to do, we've already fully done. The humongous part of our job is really the more than 2/3 that sits in our supply chain, because our commitment is a full scope-free commitment. So it goes straight to the agricultural commodities that we source. And that means we have to work with hundreds of thousands of farmers around the world to make that transition. When we do that, from a social perspective, we're very committed to what we call a shared transition and a responsible transition. So not something that we just do by fiat, to kind of say, do it this way or else, because we recognize that farmers in that supply chain are very often the most exposed people. They have financially the least cushion. They're basically exposed to the elements of the climate and the weather. And unless you help them with scientific advice and very often also capital to make that transition, it won't happen. I've seen some of these changes with conservation agriculture and regenerative agriculture on the ground. They're absolutely amazing what you can do. But the unfortunate news is that in almost all the agricultural commodities, there is an initial valley of tears where you have to put an additional investment, and then depending on the crop, for a number of years, you have less output for more work. And that, for those of you who hold a job and get a paycheck, if your boss tells you, I have great news, work harder and earn less, that is not an attractive proposition. And so this is then where we believe, if we want to get there, if we want to have that just transition, we have to step up, we have to help arrange financing, we have to give the technological advice, and then this is the way we can facilitate it. We're in direct contact with around 600,000 to 700,000 farmers around the world. We're also very often in direct contact with the cooperatives of a group of farmers that we buy from. Unlike some other firms, we buy very little through just the major agricultural exchanges. And so we believe that we can make that change happen on the ground, and we're quite committed to it. So those are the two major work streams, the good for you, good for the planet. Good for the planet, in the interest of time, I won't get into some of the other major challenges. Think about plastic pollution and others. I'm sure we can touch upon them in the discussion. But above and beyond, I think the defining issue of our time is the greenhouse gas emission reduction. No matter whether you look at our industry or other industries, it is certainly the most expensive one. And yet, I'm very convinced if in 50 or 100 years, people will look back on this time. If we do get it under control, it'll be a colossal achievement. If we don't get it under control, there'll be a lot of ugly problems that stem from the fact that we didn't get it under control. And hence, we have our work cut out for us, whether in food industry or elsewhere. And we're committed to stepping up to it and being the responsible producer in this space. I'll stop it here and look forward to the discussion and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate that. So our time, we have about 40 more minutes together. We're going to end right at 5:05. We were going to get back to good SBA time. And if you have a question, our team here have some cards. You can write questions down on the cards. They're going to bring them up to me, and then I'm going to go through them. And I'll pop them to Mark, and we go through once. Ava Marie, I'm going to introduce Ava Marie in a second. So the assistants, you can put your hands up. If you have a question, put your hand up, and they'll bring the cards over. And I have one request. Please write it so I can read it. Okay? That might be the hardest thing, because if I can't read it, I'll just keep going, because I'm anticipating a whole lot of questions. So, Ava Marie, we are really pleased that you can join us. Ava Marie is an assistant professor and group leader at the ETH's Food Systems Economics and Policy Group in the Department of Environmental System Science, or as we call it, DEUSYS. And she holds a PhD in agriculture economics from the University of Göttingen, was a postdoc at Cornell, one of my alma maters, Minnesota, I said it right, I know Minnesota, right? And an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen. Her group conducts applied research that contributes to a better understanding of how to reduce the social footprint of food systems, focusing especially on hired labor and lower income nations. So let's give Ava Marie a nice round of applause. Welcome. So, Ava Marie, comments?
Yeah.
Response, yeah.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. And thanks for the very interesting talk. Many good points, and I wrote down 4, so maybe I can add a little bit or challenge maybe also what was said. So what I heard was there are so many challenges. So the food that we eat is bad for our health, and it's also bad for our climate. I think that's something we can all agree on. And since you pointed out we are working on social sustainability, of course, I would add that the food that we eat is often also very bad for the health of other people. So not all farm workers look like this lady here in a nice clean outfit. So the food that we eat also causes health problems for the people who work in this area. And of course, many trade-offs also between the different environmental and social goals. And then, of course, what I would also add is these are challenging times where we have so many different crises, and also many changes like supply chain disruption as a result of climate change, conflicts, and all of these issues. And in addition, what was also mentioned is all these changes in dietary patterns. So people ask ask for different food. They want more sustainable food, especially in high-income countries, where it becomes important also for private companies to address these sustainability issues. And I also heard innovations, many innovative ideas, and of course also a lot of money that goes into these innovative ideas. And there, my question is, of course, who will benefit from these innovations, and who can afford these innovations that will make some people healthier? And maybe the last one would be linked to the previous one on sustainability management. And I think this is not just something that concerns Nestle or ETH. It's a broader societal trend that people want food that does not hurt the environment or people along the supply chain. We also see that in discussions in many countries, supply chain laws, due diligence legislations. This is just a broader societal trend, I would say, which is very important. And we also see so many things happening because of this societal trend. But then, of course, the last point I would make also regarding climate change, the speed at which we are addressing these challenges and we are developing innovations. It feels we have to be faster and act quicker.
So, which one of those you want to take on?
Broad range of things, maybe two of them. One is starting with the last one. The planet is warming. So all of us, everyone, we started to react late. And with this net zero commitment, I mean, essentially what we're signing up to under the science that is available today is a plan where people hope that it would limit the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrialization levels. Now, we are on that plan. That's basically what I'm telling you. The problem is not whether we go 1 year faster or slower. We're committed to it. The problem is there is a wide range of companies, there's a lot of people out there that couldn't care less about it. And so I think here what we all need to do, and where I think we all need to ask the questions, who do we buy from, who do we do business with, and who do we work for? We should insist on people disclosing, and we should insist on people basically signing up to plans that do something similar. To me, that's the best way. We are late. We shouldn't panic. What we need to do now is work out solutions to the problems. But what we all can do as future employees, as consumers and so forth, is be discerning about the companies that don't do their fair share. Just like you insist on companies paying their taxes. I mean, do insist on companies doing their fair share when it comes to being totally transparent and also showing progress towards a goal that is very important to all of us. On the innovation side, just very clear with our head of technology here in the room, we have programs that are specifically designed for affordability, like, to really allow someone in sub-Saharan Africa to bring a meal home at night with the cash earnings of the day. And so what we call popularly priced products and really extremely affordable products, that is a distinct research focus of ours. So we're not only focusing the top end. I talked about the top end when I mentioned this I have a dream kind of thing. But there is lots of projects in our roster that really appeal to other income levels. I'm still committed to the elite projects as well, because I think there's usually a lot of trickle-down effects from those over time. So as someone who's been for several years now a committed Tesla driver, no surprise to me that they started with premium cars. They would be bankrupt by now if they had started with everyday affordable cars. By making it in premium cars, they generated the funds to get down over time. And we see the same in some of our products. So plant-based burgers or plant-based chicken products initially were more expensive and still are than the original. But you see the gap closing, and over time, I'm pretty convinced they will come to the same price levels.
So I'm going to pick up on this, because when I was thinking about this, it was like, to me, there's three aspects. There's people, processes, and products. And your people you have something like 300,000 employees around the world, plus or minus. I'm not sure what it is today. This is what, and over 150,000 suppliers. At least this is what I found. Is that right? Close? Am I close or not?
Depends on how you count a supplier. With the farmers, it's a lot more. So that's why I mentioned 600,000 to 700,000.
700,000.
But of course, we also have lots of intermediaries. So there's different numbers out there.
Yeah. And so You mentioned about some of the farmers. How do you get this massive group on board with your personal and your executive team's focus on regeneration and this sort of just transition? How do you do it?
Look, on the inside of a company, I have to say, anything related to sustainability is an easy sell. And more than we probably get credit for from the outside. The company, when you look at the DNA, when you look at what it got founded on, there was a lot of sensitivity towards agriculture and a lot of exposure to it right from the beginning, because dairy, from the very first days, was such an important part of our ingredients. And so the notion of doing the right thing for the environment, that is a very easy sell. And you know, as I look at younger colleagues and recent graduates joining us, I mean, to them, it's quite often the deciding factor of who they want to work for. So that part I'm easy on. On the outside, we're not going everywhere at the same speed. So look, in some areas where suppliers are ready to give you the capacities, you go faster. And in some other areas, you also have to take the liberty at times to get slower. But together, on a consolidated basis, it amounts to an absolute reduction already now. It'll amount to the minus 20% by 2025.
Okay. So when a follow-up question, we were talking a little bit before you arrived about within the market, and you're talking something about the market power. And Nestle is one of those that has market power. Like when you make a decision, when a couple of other companies, won't leave the names out on the board, but when you make decisions, you move markets, literally.
Can I comment on that?
You're welcome to. And then I'm going to have Anne-Marie comment on it too.
I don't want to make myself or ourselves smaller than we are. But I hear that power thing all too often. We are less than 1% of the world food industry. Okay? So you see how incredibly large and decentralized that industry is. It may appear different here when you're a Swiss consumer, but there's so many ways for consuming food. We're not, I mean, when you look at normal market shares in other industries where people hold 10, 20, 30%, we're less than 1% of the world food industry. And so, yes, when it comes to the demand, we can help, you know, with some of our suppliers to create attractive business cases. But when it comes to moving you as consumers, no, we can't move you as consumers because you have 99% other choices. And so we have to convince you. We have to somehow make things exciting for you. And that is basically our challenge as marketeers.
What's your comment to say, Marie?
Yeah, I guess it depends a bit on the product, right? Probably have a larger market share for some of the products. But yeah, it makes sense that there are other players as well. And that's also what I mentioned before. It's a societal demand for more sustainability. So of course, companies, not just Nestle, many companies are addressing this demand. And I think it's a good direction.
So the first question I just kept on the top here. Are there any plans to reduce antibiotic and pesticide use across the Nestle portfolio?
So that is a key area. And that's also where you see a difference between different schools of thoughts. For example, conservation agriculture and regenerative agriculture. So under conservation agriculture, which does a lot of good things, certain pesticides and herbicides are still allowed. Regeneration is kind of more stringent about it. So at the moment, at scale, we don't see an opportunity to move away from that. Would it be desirable? Yes. And so this is where, over time, all we can do is step by step work down on some of those. So take glyphosate as an example, which is publicly quite well known. We're strongly against the use of excessive glyphosate at the end stage before harvesting as a desiccant, where it's often dumped on the plants just to make them drier. That, I think, is just significant damage to the soil, significant damage potentially to consumers, and certainly not something we advocate. But the targeted low dosage use at the beginning of the growth cycle, there we believe, you know, I mean, as usual, there's pluses and minuses to everything in life. And at the moment, when you look at the alternatives, it doesn't seem to be something much better right away available. So this is where you have to go into judgment calls. By the way, on so many of these environmental issues, you see that you have competing interests. So something that may look great on reducing plastic waste may have a terrible greenhouse gas footprint. Or, as we just now discussed here from pesticides, herbicides, if you go completely off those, and then stomach all the losses in yield that you have, and some of the food waste and the waste that goes into the system. So this is where we're facing trade-offs. And what I sometimes miss in the public debate is that that prudence and also the patience to deal with some of these trade-offs. So people just pick out one and say, what are you doing on that? And why haven't you done anything yet? Why not ban? Well, because the technology is not available in a balanced way to give an improvement.
I think you use the word balance as an interesting word you use, I think, quite often. Just how you balance between employees, the supply chain, profits, supply. And if we come back to the moment for like the nutrition, I know this is, you indicate it's very important to you. And quite a few of the products are, according to the Financial Times, are not up to some of your own standards internally. Where do you think you're going to head with this?
Yeah. So look, the notion of balance, I'll get to this right away, but the notion of balance as people who walk on 2 feet and topple over if they don't keep their balance. Yeah, balance is important in everything we do. And so whether we try to balance growth and profitability, future investment and near-term, or some of these environmental goals, there's essentially you're trying to make balanced choices in so many things, across so many dimensions of life. And so this is what it boils down to, as opposed to just picking one and saying, I solve for that, no matter what the consequences are on the rest. On nutrition, and some of the coverage you've seen, this is exactly the point I was trying to make earlier. There are products in our portfolio that, according to outside ratings, like for example the Health Star rating that we use now in our public rating, that are below the threshold that they call healthy. And so these are mostly enjoyment-related products. Think sweets, think ice cream, and so forth. And the point I was trying to make to you is, while we're trying to improve those, don't hold us as a packaged goods maker to a higher standard than the things that you're picking in any restaurant, in any bakery, in any grocery shop every day. So try to be fair. So try to think back what you ate the last 24 hours and which part of that was truly health and survival related, and which part of that did you have because you really just wanted it. You didn't need it, you wanted it. Okay? And frankly, whether you bake your own dessert or whether you buy something that's a sweet product from us in a packaged way, the difference is not that great. Okay, and so at the end of the day, don't hold us to a higher standard when it's, at the end of it, it's every one of us making these choices. And that's why I'm telling you, rather than assuming all of that is all going to go away, let's have a different way of thinking about it. Let's try and help everyone with complete transparency what is in those products. Mm-hmm. Let's try and help with portion guidance, and let's try and help in other ways to aid responsible consumption. And where I'm particularly having a soft spot is for children, because they're not able to make these rational choices. But let's preserve the freedom for all of us to try and pick the nutrition that we believe is right for us.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think you want to make something. I'm thinking of the Dunkin' Donuts, right? This is this isn't your product.
We don't own Dunkin' Donuts.
I know, don't do it, okay? Don't buy them. I'm just saying, but, I'm thinking, thank you. I'm just thinking that's, I was horrified when I saw Dunkin' Donuts come over to Europe. I was like, oh gosh, no. It's like the worst import we could imagine. But these choices, right? And this is exactly what you said. So Amy, you look like you wanted to say something to this.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point on that everyone applies very high standards. And then, of course, you also have to apply very high standards to the farmers and people who supply you with products. So I was wondering if that pressure from consumers also leads to you excluding some of the regions or shifting to other regions, because that's often a concern in the scientific literature, that higher standards will often mean that the problem just shifts somewhere else. So you have to work with other farmers if there's problems in the supply chain. Is that something that you find, or do you have any strategies to address that?
I'm consuming lots of Nestle products every day. Can I give you a precise percentage? No, I can't. It includes the sweets. So when I was telling you earlier I'm a picky eater, as an adult who is not overweight, lots of research will tell you have about 200 to 300 calories that you can fill up to your discretion. So this is where, a piece of chocolate is not a problem. If you are overweight, or if you go way beyond that, you do have a problem. But there's also lots of products related to vitamins. When I make my morning smoothies, the collagen or some of the protein that goes into our products comes from Nestle. So there's a lot of good products on the healthy scale across that health star rating system that come from our house, and I very proudly consume them. I also have no issue feeding them to my family.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're holding us
think-
to different standards. We never said that you should buy everything just from our house, just like you don't always eat out in the same restaurant. So you have a choice. You have a choice. Go to every supermarket. We do have different categories. We have lots of coffee. We have lots of other things. But you have a choice. So there's not a single piece of communication that says that you should be eating Nestle products from morning to night all day long. That's not our pitch. We are in certain things. We're not in others. Nothing wrong with that.
Okay, so let's talk about the plastic for a moment. It is actually the third question right here. So we're going to
Yeah.
let's hear about that. Let's hear about that one.
So look, I mentioned the biggest societal problem right now on the sustainability front, above and beyond, is greenhouse gases. The second largest one for us in our space, absolutely, is plastic waste. No question. We were quite open about that in our communication, not just here this afternoon, but also across our sustainability report and elsewhere. But here again, it's important to understand, how did we end up at the place where we are right now? And this is society, all of us, over the last 70, 80 years, taking advantage of the benefits that plastic packaging is bringing to food preservation. Shelf life, food safety. There's so many less cases around the world of food poisoning now than you had decades ago. Longer shelf life, the freshness of the product, reducing food waste. Again, we're talking competing interest. Plastic per se is not the problem. Plastic that spills in an uncontrolled way into the environment, that is a problem. And we're committed to trying to help to solve that. We're spending millions on recycling schemes.
So there's a person who said, I'm part of the ETH commission tasked to come up with a net zero strategy for ETH. And we're scratching our heads on how to do this. You said you've solved this problem in a few years ago, or can do it in 1 year when you were thinking within the company. How did you go about getting your net zero strategy together, and what advice could you give us?
Yeah. So look, this was a lot of work from the bottom up to only come up with the plan and then also to make it happen. And as I mentioned, and this is no exaggeration, this is frightfully expensive. These are expenses that we are shouldering that are not translating in higher prices than you find with some of the peers that don't have a plan like this, and that nonetheless we're essentially fronting. In the spirit of, if everyone waits for everyone else, the world will get nowhere. And so yeah, it's essentially, for example, think about renewable energy. So converting, this is the place where we started, converting all of the in-house uses of electricity to renewable energy. Where it's available, we're doing it already now. We're paying a premium for that. You all know that as consumers. When you tick the box on renewable energy, I mean, Switzerland is a bit of an outlier, but elsewhere, when you tick the box on renewable energy, you pay more. We pay more. In countries and places where that's not even available, we're working with people to make it available so that, by 2025, every single location that we operate around the world operates on renewable electricity. So this is the kind of stuff where very often you have years of lead time on something before you actually get to harvest the benefit when it comes to CO2 or greenhouse gas reductions. And unfortunately, there is no shortcut. There is no silver bullet. We're not doing it through offsets, in case you were wondering. This is not the way we're going. So this is true reductions that we're aiming at. And when you plant a tree, for example, in your coffee supply chain, you have to wait even for 2 years so that that seedling grows into at least a little tree before, on a yearly basis, some greenhouse gas reduction is accounted for. So there's a lot of lead time on everything we're doing before you get the benefit, and there is no shortcuts.
So someone asked a question here in regards to exactly this. Who should be footing the bill, and how are you as a firm and an ecosystem, helping these smallholders come up to your standards? Very specifically.
So the good news is, I was saying earlier, there's an initial value of tiers, so you have some upfront investment, you have some lower yields for a bit of time. On most crops, after a few years, it comes around. And then you have pretty much equal, sometimes even better yields than before. So you don't have a permanent cost associated to it. There's an initial hump that you need to get over. And it's essentially about providing that, giving the assistance on that, whether it's technological or financial, so that people can make that change. One thing I noticed visiting Swiss farms here, you had some of these younger farmers moving to either conservation or regeneration schemes in one of the richest farming communities in the world, essentially, complaining to you how when they started it, all their neighbors, sometimes their own parents, told them, don't bet the farm, you will lose the farm. And then after 3 to 5 years, all of a sudden some of the same neighbors came back and said, well, how did you do it? I'd like to do the same. And so what we try to do is help with that initial push so that over time then more and more people will benefit. But yeah, there is a cost, and we're trying to shoulder it through initial efficiencies inside. So there's lots of belt tightening that goes on inside Nestle when it comes to our operations in order to fund some of that.
And someone here has got a follow-up question that is interesting, because especially the titles in farm to food. So how can we actually measure the progress toward lowering emissions, especially with these smallhold farmers? What are you doing? What can we be doing to actually measure that at this scale?
Yeah. So here again, it gets technical, but under the Science-Based Targets Initiative, there is an entire rule book that tells you then how things get counted and what you can't count. There's lots of ways then that results get audited. So for example, growing trees, there's even satellite imagery that helps you to determine that, to what extent the tree is still there. So on everything you do, there is a rule book on that, so you can't just make your own rules. And then also, whatever number we disclose is a number that gets reviewed by our auditors. So don't just take our word for it. It is something that gets reviewed by a third party and has to hold up to those official standards.
But I come back to the smallholder farmer, because I know when you used to do 600,000 folks, and many of them are probably very, very tied to the land, or almost like subsistence, and maybe not so educated to understand indigenously. How do you help them understand what your expectations are? I mean, coming from Veve, how do you do it?
Yeah, look, good example, we talked about this at some point, was cocoa farming, where we came out with a scheme last year, which we call the Income Accelerator. And so independent of the size of the farm, we're paying the farmer a direct fee for certain practices. So for example, when they send their kids to school, there's an extra fee for that. When they do the pruning of the trees, which yields better results, they get a fee for that. That fee gets sent straight to their smartphones, because one of the realities on the ground is everyone these days has smartphones, and so you can actually administer it. And by the way, it doesn't just get sent to the husband, it gets sent equally to husband and wife to also foster some independence and also usually more prudent housekeeping and finances. And so with that, and with technology, I think we can make things happen on the ground in ways that before we couldn't. And that program, we had tested extensively. We started to roll it out in a bigger way starting from the beginning of the year. We're now way beyond 10,000 farmers on this. It's working fine. It's yielding good results. And obviously, we'll scale it up. And we saw other people in the industry also now jumping onto the same bandwagon.
So, do you have some?
Yeah, I think it links back a little bit to my question, to the previous question, applying these very high standards also to farmers that you work with. I suppose it's difficult sometimes to have them meet those standards. So did you experience any shifts in your supply chain where the products are coming from? Maybe also like looking into the future. This is a development that will just continue. So, and then with the digital technology that you mentioned, it will be easier to detect these problems in supply chains, environmental problems, but then also social problems. So do you see that you, or maybe also other companies, are already excluding certain regions or moving somewhere else? Or will you in the future try to source more locally? Or how are you addressing?
Yeah. So we are committed with working with the same people and trying to improve over time, not just walk away. Frankly, if you just walk away from some area, you're creating lots of social problems. And one of the things, as I sometimes go to the places we source from, what farmers tell me time and time again, that sometimes through 3, 4, 5 generations, even at a time of a market downturn or if there's a problem, we're not walking away from them. And that creates a feeling of responsibility. We do audit extensively on social practices and on human rights and so forth. What I ask you to give us the benefit of the doubt on, when there's occasionally a situation, and you can imagine when we're talking about 600,000 to 700,000 of those situations, when there is one where something happens that none of us wants, and it gets published. You see us immediately move to it and fix it. But give us the credit and give us the benefit of the doubt. We want the same thing everyone wants, and that is that people can work in dignity, make the products, and make a living of it. And the fact that occasionally, in spite of all the efforts to audit and to check, app use happens, doesn't mean we want that. We want the same thing. The minute we hear about something, we stop it, we improve it. But occasionally, again, across hundreds of thousands, and with their suppliers, millions of situations around the world, it's not realistic to assume that just because we say it this way, everyone automatically exactly does it this way.
Takes a while.
Yeah, it makes sense because that would also involve costs, right? Finding other suppliers. But then if you look into the future, because I also saw you have quite some investment in other crops, legumes. So would you say legumes is one of the new crops, like with changing dietary patterns, like more plant-based diets? What are the new regions or crops or technologies that you think you will focus on?
Yeah. So soy demand, for example, is going up a lot in Europe, and you wouldn't want to source soy to too large an extent from countries where you can't be sure about a non-GMO origin. And so in the Danube region of Europe, you see now lots more soy being planted. Switzerland would probably not be the best way to do this. But clearly there are places in Europe where you should do it. And so we aid those changes, and then also try to place our manufacturing where those products are made. So on the plant-based protein sources, clearly soy, and then also pea and fava are some of those that I think are going to be in demand going forward, no question. Lentils as well.
And so how's that going to change with climate change? Because we were talking about before, with climate change, a lot of those zones which are now fertile for legumes will no longer be fertile. So how far out are you thinking about the impacts of the +2, +2.5 world?
Yeah, look, this applies to so many commodities. With changing climate patterns, the best place to make something will be changing over time. But let me tell you a good piece of news on agriculture. You have a choice every spring, okay? And so as climate changes, pretty much then those areas where you plant something is also changing. And farmers at heart are not just farmers. Farmers are also entrepreneurs. And we're seeing this even close by in Europe. Depending on where the demand goes, and also depending on how climate conditions change, pretty much farmers change their behavior on what they plant. And so to me, this is a gradual transition.
One question, there are a couple of questions in here around, you talked about net zero, but getting to by 2050, why can't climate neutrality, why can't you achieve it earlier?
If you listen to what I told you, you'll see what a massive undertaking it is. And so frankly, on a full scope 3, as we have laid it out, I don't see a chance to do this earlier. And be very careful when companies tell you that they're going to be doing it by 2040 or 2030. Most of the time, that is a scope 2 commitment, which is not the same thing. And the bulk of these emissions lies in the supply chain, and hence this is where the hard work needs to be done. So we took the hardest and most unforgiving one and basically designed the commitment on that. And also, by the way, when you listen to some IT companies here and there, when they even claim to do this by 2030 or become carbon positive, well, if I was an IT company, by the time you switch to renewable energy, most of the work is done. Okay, so this is a lot easier than this granular, across hundreds of thousands of sources, change that I'm talking about.
So I have a question. You met Regeneration. I know you personally have been, you've met Paul Hawken, you've met some others. Where did your interest in regeneration come from? And why do you think this is something that all of us should be thinking about?
Yeah. So Paul Hawken is one of the pioneers of the regeneration movement. I think he's even one of the fathers of that term. And so he's someone that we work with very closely for technical and agricultural advice. And what appeals to me is, unlike so many of the sustainability approaches, where the idea is to minimize the damage, but there's still damage. The idea of regeneration is that, over time, what you want to get to is a process that by itself tends to be more in balance. and also helps to repair some of the damage that around the world that we're seeing that's already being done. And so to me, it is ultimately, when it comes to a goal to strive towards, the more aspiring one.
Mm-hmm. And so if we think of regenerative agriculture or regenerative societies, I think some of the questions here are really around this regenerating our systems, right? Is there a certain, I think, shining exemplar which you would say we should actually take a look at? Of all of the things you've been working on for the past few years at the company, some of them probably are not, or maybe they're all in the public sphere. Is there one which you could suggest that we might take a look at, or I might take a look at, that I could say, that's really cool? Does something come to mind?
Let me think about it for a minute more.
Okay.
Look, I think
that's right.
That's what I'm saying. Against what's happening around us and what we see with the climate, so much out of control everywhere, the defining issue of the time is climate change. And so being focused on that as a big theme and trying to get that under control and also avoiding all the negative secondary, tertiary consequences that come from it if we don't get it under control. That to me is the one that, as a business person, it's always like, okay, go after the biggest thing first, and that is the biggest thing. So let's stay focused on it. There's many other things we're doing around the locations, hundreds and thousands of locations around the world. I mean, when it comes to the social contributions, to the communities where we do business and all of that, there's many individual circumstances, but then you get down to storytelling. The big one above and beyond, where we're talking literally costs now stretching into the hundreds of millions and eventually billions, that's the decarbonization. And to put it in perspective, think about all you've done today, just to get here. Okay, think about the carbon footprint you already had, just on this Friday. Okay? And literally anything that happened in industrialization for the last 150, 200 years is built on the sea atom. And when we sort of lightly say decarbonization, getting that goddamn sea atom out of it, that's absolutely massive. We are rebuilding our economy one more time with other solutions. Everything that has been done. And so that's also the answer if you're impatient about 2050. Good luck if you're trying to do that faster. Okay, so this is where I think the humility of understanding what we're up against is very important.
Yeah, no, this is what's so silly to burn carbon in so many ways, because it is such a great molecule. Because we brought up packaging before, and packaging labeling. And there's a question here which is around, could you imagine putting carbon footprint labeling on packages? And how would one go about even beginning to do that?
I would love to do it. What I'd like to see is a standard we can all adhere to, so that people don't mislead the consumer. So take on nutrition, Nutri-Score, for example. There you have something. You can always argue there's something better, or you might want to tweak it, but at least there's one standard, easy to understand, and you don't have to be an expert. One look and you know what you're buying. So if we had a standard like that a larger number of players would sign up to, I would love it, because eventually, to me, front of the pack on anything you buy should have something about the nutritional value and should have something about the environmental footprint, including climate. And if you mix the two together, it gets confusing, but the two are the two dimensions that really matter. So would love to do it.
Yeah, I'd like to add embodied water to that one, too. Embodied water would be a nice one to incorporate. So let's just, excuse me, so we're going to do the biodiversity one right now. You can sit, can you mind sitting down? Thank you. Thank you, thank you. So biodiversity is very interesting. I was just in Malaysia, excuse me. Thank you. I was just in Malaysia a few weeks ago, and I was looking at, as you were saying, palm oil. Madam, thank you. So I was actually observing a palm plantation being planted, and talking to the taxi drivers, telling me it takes them 3-4 years in order for it to become productive. But the biodiversity question is actually a very interesting one, and to what degree, within Nestle, with your 600, 700,000 farmers, et cetera, who are part of also the crisis and the solution, what are you all doing to help with this issue?
Yeah. So biodiversity is a key concern, and we are also worried about that narrowing that you have on monocultures and a lower number of crops. Here again, it's very important to keep in mind we alone cannot solve that problem. We're trying to help, but keep that number in mind, less than 1%. okay, not the 30, 20% that you might see in other areas. And so we're doing our part. We're trying, for example, when it comes to the way under regenerative agriculture that a field is designed, when it comes to cover crops, when it comes to intermittent cropping, there's lots of ways that you can help preserve biodiversity. It's a very abstract concept that, in this room may appeal to a lot of people. It's not an easy one to communicate. Here's also another challenge that we have to work on, how we get that notion across to the consumer. But it is a concept that under regeneration is covered. And as part of our plans to source more and more regeneratively sourced products, yes, we're trying to address it as well.
So, Mark, we have come to the end of our time. Maybe it wasn't a satisfactory answer. We haven't been able to touch on many things. I'm sure you came with questions in your mind. And any time we have such a prominent human who is in many different things, we have plastic bottles up here on our tables, sort of to say. It's an interesting question on what can we talk about in an hour. And I'm really grateful to you, Eva Marie, and to you, Mark, to coming to talk about this issue, which we wanted to focus on tonight, was from farm to table and some of the issues around the farm and that supply chain. And it's really been a pleasure and honor to have you here at ETH. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.